Nothing. You know what I'm seeing? I'm seeing the trees and 4 hours on the train in Finland. Just the trees and the trees
while the
and
rest
the
of us were
trees
working.
and the trees.
You
I was
know?
working. I was grading on the train.
Yep.
I was. Mostly.
In Finland.
In Finland. As we all should be. Helsinki was delightful.
Helsinki is always delightful. Maybe you should have gone to grad school there.
No. Actually.
Well, actually, now that you mention it, maybe I should have.
Now you tell me.
But look, choosing a graduate school
Is important.
and also very tricky. Like, particularly
Yes, it is.
if you have no one else in your family or you have no, like, relationships with anyone who's ever done it. So if you're like a first gen, which I was, you were not. But if you're like a first gen person trying to figure out where to go to graduate school, why to go to graduate school, how to do it, like all of that is a massive mess to figure out.
And I think that my parents have gone to graduate school, but very early on they were both veterinarians. But the world of graduate school has changed so much that I was actually, I mean, we've never talked about it, but beyond that, there was no parallel between what happens in medical school and how graduate school works in a different country to my experience trying to go to graduate school in the United States. And that was the only place I really applied was in the United States. And they couldn't help me in any way, shape, or form because they went through a totally different process. So yeah, there are many weird things about applying for graduate school.
Totally. And so I think in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of thinking about what program you want to apply to, which schools, how do you find them? Like, what should you be thinking about as you're considering taking on this massive kind of life change, particularly if you're thinking about going full-time, those kinds of things.
And even if you're not, it's going to shape, even if you become what we call stayers, so you stay put, you're still working, and you're going to graduate school, even then your life changes quite significantly because you spend a lot of your afternoons, a good portion of your summer potentially, going to school, which affects if you have a family life, if you just have a social life, your social life. It changes everything that happens in the rest of your life, even if your work life stays the same. So that's really a big decision. And what I'm asking you is if you're watching this podcast and you're already in graduate school, give it to your friends who are not yet in graduate school, because you think about graduate school for quite a while before you pull the trigger and before you make a decision. And so there are people who start thinking about graduate school, and that's a great time to start really doing the hard work of sorting, talking to people, thinking about what your options are and where your heart lies and what you can afford, because I think that's a big chunk of making decisions.
So you were still in Israel when you were preparing to apply for grad school. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that's like? Because I already lived here.
So I think there are a few layers to that. One is, for me, graduate school in the United States, school in the United States was a big black box. I really did not understand it in any way, shape, or form.
Like in an airplane? Like a big black box in an airplane?
Kinda. Hopefully you don't find it after the crash. But
that's where I was going, and I was a little confused.
But you don't know what's going on. You don't understand it. So one of the first things that I did not understand, it was explained to me actually after I came to the United States, and that was that applying for a master's program was not a good move. So I applied for master's program, and that made it so almost nobody offered me money. And money is, if you're coming full time, you got to make sure there's some money coming somewhere. And when you're an American citizen, it's much easier because you can take a loan. There's no such thing as a school loan, for example, in Israel. There's no such thing. So for me, taking a loan was not even an option. And definitely, if you're coming from another country, nobody's going to give you a loan if you don't have a credit history, and actually you won't be allowed into the country without showing you have resources. That's part of the immigration process. So there are lots of things you don't actually know. And one of the things nobody told me, even though I went to the American Embassy and I consulted and I took the tests and I got all the materials at that point from the GRE and all of that, nobody says most universities will give money to talented doctoral students, but very rarely to master's students. And so that's something that's important to know, and you have to think about either I'm going to get my master's somewhere else and do it in a way that's meaningful, or I come and I try to get into a program that takes me straight to a PhD, or to a PhD, in my case, to a PhD via a master's, but it is clear almost from the get-go that there's going to be a PhD program, because we know we have very limited resources as faculty, and when we invest in a student, we invest in students that are going to be the longest with us, and that can help us by teaching in our program, by helping us do research, and that's usually doctoral students. So that was the first thing nobody told me. The next thing that I really didn't think about, and now as a grown-up, I'm thinking to myself, I had 2 little kids, and I wasn't thinking about cost.
So I would love to know a little bit more about, like, that's the technical, like,
Yes.
applications, test scores, yada yada. I would love to know more about, like, because you were married, and had children at that point. Yes. Do I remember that correctly?
I had 2 kids.
How did you figure all of that out? Because, like, I was single at that point, newly.
Yeah.
And was like, I'm gonna move wherever I want.
Yes.
So how did that work for you? Like, what was?
There were.
How did you figure out where to apply?
A couple of pieces. So there were a couple of pieces that went into that. First of all, and I say that to all of the students or potential students I talk to, it's really a family decision, especially if you're going to move. But even if you're not going to move, because it has financial implication, it has free time implications, you've got to talk to your significant other, you've got to think about where your kids are. Luckily or unluckily, my kids were very young. They were 2 and 4 when we moved. And at that age, while they need a lot of care, all of the care comes from you, or most of the care comes from you. So you can say, hey, we're packing up and we're going, and they barely have language to ask where are we going and why. And so, in a way,
we're just moving. We're just going.
And 4 years later, I moved them to Nebraska to a job, and that was a completely different process. So as they grew up, the decision-making changes, and I know a lot of people who have said, you know, I want to start a doctoral program, but my kids are finishing high school, I want to be there until they finish and start college, and that's my trigger point to start a program. So there's an ebb and flow in kids' lives and in family lives where it makes sense, and it was early enough, and both Sarah and I think, really knew that this was the right time to start a new career and to really take that bold step and kind of uproot ourselves and go. The other piece of this, at least for me, was my work life was really, really busy. It still is. But it was,
How has that changed?
It was really, really busy. So I could not fathom being that busy and trying to go to graduate school in Israel. It was very clear to me. I have tried once, and it was very clear to me that as long as I have all of my connections and commitments, it's always going to come last. And this is one of the problems that I see always with stayers. You have a work life, and that is important because that's what pays the bills and that's what makes sure your family is doing fine. And you have your social connections and your family. And so school tends to be the thing you push and you do last. And there are certain things you can do late at night, but there are certain things in graduate school you cannot do late at night. Read long philosophical chapters about epistemology do not happen between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Many other things can happen. That's not going to happen, at least not well. So the decision for me to move was based on that. If I want to be serious about graduate school and go and do it and finish it and go to wherever my next step in my career is going to be, and it was not clear to me that it was going to be a faculty, but it was clear to me that it opens new doors. I had to uproot myself and go and focus on that thing I'm doing. And so that was part of the decision. What did I do? We went and At that time, we had the big books that we had at the embassy that were chained to the desk, like medieval texts. It was literally in a special
Makes you think about those old telephone books.
Yes,
like who would
exactly
steal
like
the
that.
telephone book? Someone might actually steal that, though.
Yeah, somebody might.
Probably
and they had
security
all
measure.
the graduate programs, and we did a lot of work. Beginning of the internet, you can already search programs online and find some names. And I had a very specific field, which I ended up not doing, which was adolescents and adults with learning disabilities. So I had 4 programs that were very high on my list. And I applied to all 4 of them. I got accepted by all 4 of them. But one in Northwestern gave me a partial fellowship, and one at UCR gave me a full fellowship, and that was the easiest thing.
Yeah,
it was an easy decision.
UCR, California Riverside, right?
Yeah, and they simply they gambled on me staying beyond my master's, which has happened, and so they were willing to put the money, and for me with 2 kids, it was not a hard decision to see, okay, these places, I'm going to be in debt. I don't know how I'm going to pay for that. This place is paying. Now, it's very little money, and but they're covering tuition, and I'm not paying international student tuition. And on top of that, they're helping me with the housing, and eventually with kids, because it was California, also helped with childcare. So there was an envelope around us. And that's one of the things I say to anybody who wants to go full-time is you've got to find a program that's willing to support you. If not, I don't think it's worth it. I don't think you can survive. You're going to get into a lot of debt. And the problem and the thing we know about debt, I would argue, is it constrains your decision-making after. Because now you're thinking about, okay, I have all of this debt I need to pay. I don't have the freedom to choose between jobs. I got to take what's out there. So I think it has an impact. And so if you are going into a program and definitely going full-time, I would argue that one of the things you want is a fellowship.
Well, because you have to, be able to pay for what's happening, particularly if you are not a stayer, right?
Yeah.
You need to have things to, you also just need to have things to do.
Yeah.
Right? Particularly if you've up and moved somewhere new where you don't have social connections, you need some kind of specific job or task to not make yourself crazy, or was that just me?
No, I think you do, because suddenly you have a lot of free time. If all you're doing is going to 3 or 4 classes a week, that's a lot of free time. It is a lot.
3 to 4 classes is a lot. It's a lot of reading, but in the beginning, particularly for me as a teacher, I just kept thinking oh my gosh, I used to have all of this detritus of my time with my first graders throughout the day, and now I'm just, reading, and there wasn't as much tangible, visible signs of the work that I was doing.
And more than that, I would argue also from the way you think about how you construct a graduate program, one of the things you want to have is lots of experiences inside that program, doing research and teaching and all of that, because if you at any time point decide that that's your future, you want to show that you have that experience, and also you want to enter those jobs knowing what they're like. Being able to observe them as a graduate student, observe professors doing their work, but also participating in the work. So when you decide, yes, I want to do that, you actually know what you're signing up for. And not just oh, it sounds interesting, we do some research, we teach some, we do some service, and not knowing what it is, you don't actually know what you're committing to, and also it's hard to prove that you can do the job. So you definitely want that fellowship and some kind of a way to connect to the institution. And my question to you is, how did you make the decision not having to think about family and that whole, because for us it was over a very long period of time. So we had to think about it for over a year. At that time, everybody required the GRE. I took the GRE. I'm a good test taker, so it was a delightful experience. But I took the GRE, but then applying and moving through all of those phases and deciding as a family and all of that's a long time. That's over a year of planning and maneuvering and all of that. How did you do it?
So you'll be surprised because there was not a spreadsheet involved.
Oh, wow.
There
was
not a table. The one time. No, as I kind of alluded to before, it was for lack of a better word, I was responding to the chaos that was my life at that time. Like, things had rapidly changed. My mom had passed away. Relationship had ended. Like, all of this stuff had happened, and like, I wasn't seeking out graduate school as therapy because, one, graduate school is not therapy. Get a therapist, it's cheaper. But like, I had been grappling with like who my mother was and who she would never be, and like who I was and who I was trying to become, and so I decided I was gonna go get my PhD. I had been working on my master's at Michigan State. Actually didn't finish my master's at Michigan State because they didn't offer the capstone when they said they were going to offer the capstone, and so that's a thing. And so I started asking around, like, where should I be applying? Like, what should I be doing? Here's what I'm interested in, and really leveraged the professors who were really important in my development, and actually ended up at Indiana because Elizabeth Heilman was like, hey, that was my program. I feel like you'd be a good fit, right? So it was this kind of like slapdash. There wasn't as much, looking back on it, there was not as much thought in it, particularly given like who I am now as an academic and who I am now as a teacher educator. I probably would have made some different choices, but part of it, one, was, holy cow, I was young. Like, I don't know that I had my adult brain yet.
Okay.
And was not thinking about things in the way that I do now. But I think one of the things that I did that was really good was I went and actually visited schools. I went and like talked with faculty. I talked with grad students, like, and that really gave me a feeling of kind of what that space was about. And I made sure there were like formal and informal spaces. You know, and the minute a grad student starts crying, that's not where I'm going.
Yeah.
Like, I don't need to cry. Like, I don't need this to be more difficult than it is in order to get a name of an institution on my degree program.
And so, if you do have access, your advice would still be talk to the people you know, and talk to people in general?
Talk to people you know. Think about like what you're interested in at that point in time, knowing that it might change. Like, in anticipation for this, I was going back and looking through all of my like application materials, and I was like, is that who I was? Is that what work I thought I was going to be doing at this age? Like, what? Because it totally does not match up with like what I actually do now, and I think that's fine, right? It's just growth. It happens. I also think part of it was like the branding, right? Like, when you're working on your application materials, like, you need to figure out what your branding is, and that was also very apparent. Like, I had that first research experience as an undergrad working in the marketing department at the Broad Business School, like, that totally has played out. Right? Like, selling myself as, I am this kind of student, I want to study these kind of things, and I want to make these kind of solutions, and like really selling myself to that program. But that's not what I do now. I mean, I still do good work. I do good work.
Yeah, that actually is probably better after you have some growth. And just to plug into that branding when you apply, and we're going to talk at another time about the application process and what you want to do. But one of the things I always advise people is talk about what you're interested in, but don't close yourself in a box, because we all know, we've gone through this, we all know you change even throughout the process. The reason I'm right now in reading, among other things, and in literacy and in technology is the experiences I had in graduate school, not before graduate school. So the things I've said, I've explored, and actually my dissertation was about that, but I have made a lot of very good decisions about, I would say they're good decisions. I'm not sure everybody else would agree, but a lot of really good decisions about the things I want to do, influenced by the people I worked with and the ideas I was exposed to. And there's no way for you to predict early on what's that going to be, but that does have something to do with the place you choose.
Right. And one of the things that I was really influential in picking the institution that I chose was I felt like there was latitude to change.
Yeah.
There was latitude for sometimes maybe perhaps a bit too much, actually, now that I think about it. But I really liked the fact that I had kind of control over what I studied, and my advisor and my committee, they were never like, oh, you need to study this because this is what I study, which is a model,
Yeah,
right? Like,
it is.
That's a
And
model.
some people do it that way.
And so I really appreciated having some options around that flexibility and to be able to grow in interesting ways.
And so another conflict or a way of thinking about it that I think is really important as you start exploring is thinking about what do you want to be, especially if you're a mover. Because the famous school is like when you look at their rankings, they're the top 10 graduate education schools and that kind of thing. And you really have to think about the benefits of being a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond kind of situation. And I think about Malcolm Gladwell, who talked about this a little bit in David and Goliath. And I've seen a lot of people that actually thrived, for example, here at UNL, and I would argue we are a fairly small pond. We are not Michigan State or Harvard or one of those big schools where that's the first name everybody thinks about. But because of that, we've had students that have had really successful graduate experiences with kind of top-notch experiences being on projects and teaching and having lots of opportunities because there aren't another 30 with their skill set right around them. They're the one student who has an engineering background or the one student who has a language background in combination with something else. And so, or with technology, for example, and so, or one of very few, so they get to interact a lot with everybody, and they get to participate on any exciting project that is out there, and actually they can choose what they're participating in. Whereas when you go to a big school, sometimes you are the last one added in a list of 25 doctoral students, which is a huge number to be in this very specific program. And that means you just have less opportunities. You're competing and you're sharing all the time, and that has advantages, but it has some disadvantages as well. So for me, for example, when we looked at the schools, I looked at some, there weren't actually any of the big top 10 schools because my area was niche enough to not have that expertise at the Harvard or something like that. But, and as a result, I ended up with 4 institutions that I applied for, and some of it was money, right? And even then, we were paying, I don't know, $70 or maybe more to apply for school, which now isn't that bad, but $70 25 years ago was quite a bit of money, definitely if you're earning in Israeli shekels and not in dollars. And you have to get a special, you got, any international student knows this, you got to go to special banks and get special checks. I mean, this is, today it's easier because we all have credit cards and they're international, and you can Venmo and you can do 1,000 other things that may work or may not work, but different countries have different controls over foreign exchange, and it gets really complicated really fast for an international student. And so selecting a few schools with a high probability, not just of getting in, but actually these are places you want to go. Back to when we had the conversation about where do you apply for work, it's kind of the same. You really want to have places that if they say yes, you're going to seriously consider them and not just say, oh, I was applying just for fun. It's really not worth it.
Right, and that's like the only school I got denied admission to was also the only school that asked for the other schools I was applying to, which I think that was a mistake. Should not have done that. Yeah. But I wanted to be a stayer. I wanted to stay in my classroom. I wanted to continue working. I wasn't quite ready to leave the classroom yet. But when they were like, nope, sorry, coming here, I made the decision to leave. And that worked out really well. But one of the things was, could I live in Bloomington, Indiana for 4 years, and then in Columbus, Indiana for another year? And it turned out that I could. I actually really enjoyed my time there quite a bit. great farmers market. Shout out Bloomington. But also like, to go back to your, just how important funding is, like one of the things that was so important about that graduate program was I was lucky enough to have offers of funding at every school that I was accepted to. And then Indiana was the one institution that this was definitely in their pro column, but it wasn't the full reason that I accepted my position there as a grad student. But they had programs that would support you if you needed an additional year. I needed a fifth year to finish up my dissertation, and there was a program that allowed me to do that and not take on additional debt.
And that's an important conversation to have early on to understand how the funding works, especially if you get the fellowship. No, nothing is ever fully guaranteed, but most schools will say, we will support you for 4 years or something to that, unless you underperform in very specific ways. And most schools want to support you because you become, as a graduate student, you become more involved and more useful and more productive as time wears on.
You're an investment.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're looking at you as an investment who's going to help support the department and really become part of the living cloth of that. And I didn't understand that when I first applied.
Yeah.
Like how integrated I would become with that department. Like that was a really valuable thing for me, having moved from having my own self-contained classroom and losing that, right? But yeah, it seems like one of the points that I think we want to make is like, money is not the only thing, but it's definitely a consideration, right? Like it's something that you need to balance as you're thinking about applying to graduate school. It's not just the funding or the fellowship, it's also, can you live in this place for the next 4 to 5 years, 6 years maybe? Can you be happy there? Does the program set you up to do what you want to do? What's the ROI going to be on this, right? Like, how is it setting you up for the kinds of work that you want to do? Whether it's you want to be a professor, or you want to go back out into nonprofit work, or you want to work for a private corporation.
Or you want to go back to schools and public schools and work at the district or whatever the next thing is.
And how is it going to set you up for that? And then can you afford to live there, right? Like, and also, like, is it, like you landed in California, which California is lovely.
It depends where you are, and one of the things that UCR had as their package is they had family student housing that was incredibly affordable. I don't think I could have afforded anything else outside campus.
Right.
And so that was delightful, and when there are opportunities like that, you're also around other students, so you get a richer experience in multiple ways. In our case, we also lived basically on campus. So our life for 4 years was really almost 100% on campus. My kids went to preschool on campus. We went to school. Sarah worked on campus. The one time we wouldn't go, we went on campus was when we went to IHOP. That was right off campus. That's the only place we could afford, give or take, for 4 years. So that was family night. That was kids eat free night.
At IHOP.
Yes, at IHOP.
Nice.
IHOP is not paying us. I think IHOP should. Anyway.
IHOP, sponsor us. Talk to us. We'll gladly give you a shout out.
Yeah.
Is that pandering? I might be pandering. Marketing. I'm marketing myself.
Yes. Back to.
There we go.
Let's just kind of final words as to what do you think people should think about when they're starting to think about graduate school?
I mean, think about how do you want to live your life, right? For 4 to 6 years, you're going to be tied to this institution. You're going to be tied to this work. You're going to be tied to that location. It's not forever necessarily, unless you're like a stayer and you're like, this is where my roots are. This is where I'm staying. But think about what's the goal and how does that program help you meet that goal? And as you're working towards meeting that goal, is it going to be under conditions that work for you?
And for me, there's the other side of this, and that is you can explore, you can ask. Eventually, you've got to narrow it down to a few, and you've got to just make the decision and go for it. It's always a bet. It's never a 100% thing. And if you go somewhere and it's horrible, you can actually go somewhere else or decide to do something else. It's not a do or die. So eventually you gotta take that leap of faith and say, this, I've done my due diligence, I've verified as much as I can. Now I'm taking the leap knowing that everything I'm thinking is probably only somewhat true.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that we've said this yet, but like so much of your graduate school experience is going to be you.
Yeah.
Right? So keeping in mind that each program, each school is going to have particular structures in place to support graduate students, but portions of that are how you negotiate and you navigate all of those things, right? So no school is going to be a perfect fit. No program's going to be a perfect fit.
Sure.
There's going to be, I think the goal there is to think about where is it a good enough fit that's going to set you up to do what you want to do with the least amount of unnecessary pain, because graduate programs can be painful.
Yeah, and they are to a certain degree.
A lot of writing, lots of isolation,
yes. Yeah.
Lots of reading. But it doesn't have to be, there's some unnecessary pain that sometimes gets inflicted, I feel.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. I like to avoid that.
Yes. And so this is really all about the first steps that we suggest you take on the way to becoming not that kind of doctor.
Right. Don't become that kind of doctor. If you stab yourself while cutting cheese, don't call us, because we're not that kind of doctor. And yes, I know you're not supposed to cut cheese like this. It was a one-time thing, and of course it backfired. No tendons got cut, but it happened.
And we're still here.
I'm still here, and look at that, I can move it.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. They were like, you got lucky. And I was like, yes, I did. Thank goodness, because
that graduate degree is finally working.
Well, I mean, I was more sad about the lack of knitting. But really, my literacy degree didn't help me at all because I'm not that kind of doctor.
All right.